I want to think about ways we can continue to improve our communication. For companies and organizations and executives who engage in that communication experimentation, they tend to have some of the best cultures, some of the highest productivity. Their employees have the best well-being because they find the best ways to communicate, and they take input from those beneath them to understand, okay, is this working or is this not?
In this episode, Dr. Andrew Brodsky, professor at McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin, explores how individuals and organizations can thrive in an increasingly digital workplace. Brodsky believes that choosing the right virtual communication tool at the right time fosters better organizational relationships and boosts productivity. He explains why a better understanding of virtual communication helps organizations more effectively share ideas, express authenticity, and adapt to an ever-evolving workplace. Dr. Brodsky is the author of Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication. His research examines the role technology plays in workplace behavior and the impact of virtual communication on organizational dynamics. A sought-after consultant and trainer, he has worked with global organizations including Amazon, PwC, Dell Technologies, and Novo Nordisk. His insights have been featured in the New York Times, The Economist, Harvard Business Review, and on CNBC. He has taught leadership and negotiation at Harvard and was named one of Poets and Quant's best 40 under 40 MBA professors. Special thanks to today's guest host, Christine Castillo, Chief Deputy Clerk at the U.S. Bankruptcy Court in the Eastern District of North Carolina. Christine, take it away.
Andrew, it's so nice to meet you.
It's great to meet you too. Thanks for having me on.
What is the central purpose of your book, and what were your motivations behind writing it?
The central purpose of the book is to understand that regardless of whether you work from the home, the office, anywhere in between, at this point, we're all virtual communicators. First, let's describe what virtual communication is. Virtual communication is any mode of communication that happens electronically. So examples of this: email, instant messaging, video calls, whether it's Zoom, Teams, WebEx, and then also phone calls are considered virtual communication. But to understand what that means, let's take a step back. The old way of being in the office was if you had a question, you'd go walk to your coworker's cubicle or knock on their office door. These days, when you have a question in the office, instead we send a Slack message or a Teams instant message, even if the person's sitting only a couple feet away. So just because we're in close proximity, we're still using all of these tools. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. With that old way of the office, anytime you had a question, you were interrupting the other person no matter what they were doing, and you didn't know if they were focused or not. Now, the nice thing with some of this technology, like instant messaging, is it allows the other person to respond when they're ready. So if they're focused on something, they can take a few minutes to respond. But to me, helping others to figure out how can I best use these tools, helping others understand all the research and science we have on that was really valuable. And that's why I wrote the book, Ping.
Would you walk us through your Ping framework and give us an example to illustrate Ping in action?
I like to have a framework when I read books because there's always so many recommendations. It's hard to remember everything. So when I wrote the book, I chose a Ping framework for the Ping book to make it easy to remember. And there's 4 parts to this: P for perspective taking, I for initiative, N for nonverbal, and G for goals. What P for perspective taking centers on is that when we're interacting virtually, we often become so much more self-focused. When you're in person, you see the other person you're interacting with. Their body's right in front of you. It's very salient. You're thinking about them. If you're writing an email or an instant message, all you're looking at is the text on the screen. It's easy to forget a person's on the other side of that screen. Even in video calls, all you're doing is looking at a small square of the other person on the screen. And that's if you're even looking at them. If you're like me and many other people, we tend to look at ourselves more because we're concerned about how we're coming off, which makes us even more self-focused. And so actually taking a moment to think about how would the other person interpret this? What are they looking for here? Can be incredibly valuable exercise because it doesn't happen as naturally when we're behind a screen. The next one for initiative. The point about initiative gets back to this idea that just because the communication mode is weak on a dimension or lacking something doesn't mean you can't make it better. You can't add it back in. There was research on negotiations, and they found that in person negotiators did better than those that were negotiating over chat or email. And they found this was because people in person, they tended to what they called schmooze more. So engage in the small talk where they got to learn about each other. It was a little bit more casual. And as a result, they built more trust and then they had better outcomes. But what these researchers did in one of the conditions is for those who were going to negotiate via chat or email, they had them for 5 minutes before the negotiation have a quick schmoozing phone call with their partner just to kind of have that small talk. So taking the initiative to schmooze virtually before they went into text-based negotiation, and those negotiators who took those few minutes of schmooze that took that initiative, they did just as good as those that were in person. They built more trust, they built rapport, much better than those virtual communicators who didn't. And they had better negotiation outcomes, not just for themselves, but for their partner as well. So for initiative, it's this idea about thinking about what's the weakness here and not taking that as fact, but actually thinking about how can I improve upon that? What can I add back in? Next, N for nonverbal. There is so much different nonverbal behavior that happens virtually that just doesn't happen in person. We've got emojis, we've got exclamation marks, we've got the time of day a message is sent relays information. If you're on video, does eye contact matter? Does your background matter? There's so many different things. So understanding the science behind, well, what do these cues mean? How are others interpreting them? Is vital for making sure your messages come off as intended, because the nonverbal behavior that happens virtually doesn't come as naturally to us as those interactions in person. And lastly, G for goals. And I wish I could tell the listeners to this that there's one best mode of communication. That would make life easier. That would make for a very short book. But there isn't. It really depends on what you're trying to get out of an interaction. The big one that I often hear talk about is it better to have cameras on or cameras off during meetings? And the answer to this is it depends. Research shows that cameras on can be useful for building trust. We tend not to trust those if we don't know what they look like. We don't know their mannerisms. It can also be useful for making it seem like you're engaged. During a video call, if it seems like the other person's staring at you, that's really useful. It makes it seem like they care. But on the other side of that, there's a bunch of studies that show something called video conferencing fatigue or Zoom fatigue, which is that when our cameras are on, it's more exhausting, it's more fatiguing, it can cause more stress, and that can spill over even after the video call. And the reason often is that we're staring at ourselves during the video call, making sure everything looks perfect, and that can be really, really stressful. So bringing this all together with goals, what research might suggest is that if it's a new interaction or one where it's important for you to seem like you're engaged, cameras on is better. But if you have an existing team, you've got people who know each other really well, then cameras off can be beneficial because it gives people back that extra energy to focus on the task at hand as opposed to how they look on those video calls. So altogether, that's the PING framework: perspective taking, initiative, nonverbal, goals.
What is virtual communication self-efficacy, and would you share an example of why it matters?
Research has interestingly shown that there are two things that really impact how good we are at communication. One is, do we actually know what we're doing? Do we know the best mode to use? Do we know how to use it in the best way? How do we make sure our emails come across as intended? But the other side of that is what's called virtual communication efficacy. It's how confident do we feel about our ability to use a communication mode? And what research has shown is that this type of self-efficacy can be sometimes just as important, if not more important, than how we actually know how to use the mode or not. And as an example for you to think about, if you're on a video call with someone and they're nervous to be on camera, you can tell They keep like checking how they're looking. You could see them fidgeting a little bit. Or if you've gotten an email from someone who's really nervous about using email, it's probably like 5 paragraphs too long. There's too many apologies in there. So this feeling that you're good at it sometimes is just as important as actually being good at it.
People often say that in person communication is best. So, would you give an example where virtual communication is better?
As a researcher, I love to challenge people's assumptions. An example that I think really tends to hit home is imagine you have two different friends. One of the friends you see in person maybe once every 3 or 4 months for a few hours. The other person, you send one text message back and forth each day. So just a quick like checking in, or say one thing each day. I'm guessing most listeners, if I asked, well, who you're closer to, most people would say, well, it's the person I'm texting every single day. But if you think about it, the amount of time spending one text every single day, it's seconds. So if you add that up, it's probably less time than spending a few hours in person once every few months. So you're not actually spending more time communicating. Here, it's about frequency that's more important than the mode. And the idea behind this is thinking about how can we leverage the strengths of virtual communication to make it better. And in this example, one of the strengths of virtual communication is it's so easy to do. You can do it very quickly, and it doesn't have to be hours long. And in this case, getting that benefit of frequency is more important than getting the depth of an in-person interaction every so often.
What makes it difficult to bring personal tech habits into the workplace?
The issue with bringing our personal habits to the workplace is that they're not all aligned. They're often formed based on how we grew up. A big example I often hear about is younger versus older generations on email. For older generations, texting on your phone was a real pain because you had to hit the 2 button 3 times to get to the letter C. So texting wasn't exactly easy. So older generations, they used email for everything. For younger generations, there's a lot more choices of communication modes now. There's instant messaging, there's texting, there's things like Snapchat. And so for younger generations, the only time they've seen email used or where it's generally used is the workplace. When they get that email, to them, it feels really overly formal. The key thing about organizations is we need to organize together as a single group. So rather than using your own habits, it's about thinking, how can we get everyone on the same page to make sure we're not communicating past each other? And what we're intending to say is actually heard.
What parts of face to face interaction can we successfully recreate virtually?
When I hear often about executives talking about virtual communication, they talk about things like relationships or culture aren't as good when they're done virtually. And in some cases, that's absolutely true. But the thing to remember is that just because something's not as good on average doesn't mean you can't make it better. When I talk to executives, and they often say, okay, we want to bring everyone back to the office to make sure that we have a great culture. If you decide you're going to bring everyone back and suddenly there's going to be culture, that's not how it works. And so rather than thinking about where are we, thinking about how can we make it better is important.
What would be the risk of trying to force in person habits into virtual spaces?
I've seen that backfire so much. During COVID, when we all had the lockdowns, someone in my department thought it'd be a good idea to have a comedian come and do a virtual like kind of happy hour with us, which in person really fun. Over Zoom, not so much. You basically have this one comedian and then you've got 20 screens of all of us on mute. He's kind of talking to himself. And so thinking about, and this gets to the point I was raising, what are the strengths of a given mode and how can we better leverage those as opposed to trying to fit the circle peg into a square hole is the approach you want to take.
How can poor virtual communication contribute to disengagement and burnout?
Not having good communication boundaries is one of the leading causes of burnout related to work because if you're not leaving your communication off at some point, then you end up in this situation where your workday never ends. You're constantly thinking about it. And being able to rejuvenate and recalibrate after the workday is important for coming back the next day with that new energy, with that creative ability. One of the pieces of advice I often give teams when I'm consulting with them is for everyone to actually have an explicit conversation together about how we communicate. So making the implicit more explicit. That would look something like saying, okay, for emails, let's say we'll respond within 24 hours. For instant messages, we'll respond, let's say, within 2 hours. That's why if you're in a meeting or something else, you don't have to respond. If there's an emergency or something urgent, then maybe we'll do a text message or a phone call. And the nice part about having these explicit conversations is a fewfold. One is when it's open and no one knows how quickly they're expected to respond, we all feel this urgency to respond to everything all the time. And similarly, at night, we feel the need to have our notifications on, our email, instant message, text messaging, because we don't know what's important and where it's going to come from. With this approach where you've established one mode of communication, if there's something truly urgent, you can know, oh, it's a phone call. So I can turn my email and instant messages off because those can wait till the next day. And we've all talked about it. So the other person expects me not to respond if it's an email or instant message. On the sender side, most of us have had this experience where we send an email, we don't get a response. And we're wondering, should I follow up? Is it too soon to follow up? Is it going to be pushy? But if you've already had that conversation about response expectations, then it fixes that issue because we both know we respond in 24 or 48 hours to an email. So after that time, it's not weird to email them and say, hey, I didn't get a response from you. Just want to bump this in your inbox. The way to make sure you can have those boundaries is to make the implicit more explicit when it comes to the norms and expectations of how we communicate.
Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between low richness and high richness communication tools and when it's best to use each of those?
Researchers categorize communication modes on a whole variety of different dimensions, but there's two main ones that have continually been shown to be the most important. One is cue variety. So, how similar are the nonverbal behaviors to those in person? So can we see the person? Can we hear them? And the other is synchronicity. And that's how real time is the communication. Are we talking real time or is it lagged, like with email? And those two things together equate to richness. So when something's very synchronous and it's got high cue variety, that's high richness communication, like in person. When it's very low synchronicity and it's got low cue variety, which is effectively like writing a letter and sending it via the mail, which would be the lowest, that is low richness. And something to remember about these two dimensions is that even small differences can matter. As an example, in video calls are very, very slightly less synchronous than in-person interactions. There's a slight data transfer speed that happens across the internet when we're saying these video calls that can result in lags that are fractions of a millisecond. But those tiny lags can end up interrupting the flow of conversation. That's why in video calls, you accidentally interrupt each other sometimes. You've got those longer pauses because you're waiting to see if the other person's done. And that's an example in synchronicity, how even small differences matter. On the cue variety side, similarly with video and in person, it seems like, well, I can see them, I can hear them, it's the same. But that's not exactly true because you can't see their whole body. If I was in person and I was taking notes during a meeting, that would be seen as very respectful. The other person thinks, oh, they really care about it. But if in a video call, I'm looking down, it looks like I'm playing on my phone because no one can see the notepad. So if I'm looking down at my screen, even though I'm actually taking notes, the other person doesn't realize it. They think you're checking your smartphone. So even those small parts that are missing can have very large ramifications on the outcomes of an interaction.
How do emojis come across in our professional communications with others?
The research on emojis in workplace communication is interesting. Some of the research shows they're beneficial. Sometimes they make us seem warmer. Some of the research shows they're really bad because they might make us seem less competent. But there's another piece of advice that I generally recommend that's also based on a little bit of a different set of research. And that's something called language mimicry. And the concept behind language mimicry is that if the other person's using emojis, you should use them too. If they're using exclamation marks, you should use them too. If they're using certain jargon, try and use it too. And this is effective for two reasons. One, we tend to trust those who are more similar to ourselves. So when someone communicates like us, we feel like we can trust them more. And secondarily, we all think we're great communicators. So when someone else communicates like me, I think, wow, they're a great communicator too. They're doing it just the right way. And so the central point here is take your cues from the other person in a situation rather than having a blanket rule. And with just two kind of asterisks here. One is don't go way overboard where it's a game, as Simon says, because that's so overt that it backfires. And secondarily, because I know there's a lot of leaders and people in higher positions listening in on this, if you are a higher power, it is not good to engage in mimicry of those lower in power than you because it can come off as condescending. So generally, this is better as a horizontal strategy or an upward strategy, not a downward one. But again, the thinking here is rather than trying to just blanket one rule across everything, it's seeing what the other person does, taking their perspective, realizing what works for them, and then applying that.
How can virtual tools help mitigate biases and how can they exacerbate them?
When it comes to bias, we tend to react differently depending on who we're interacting with. And this is true regardless of your race, gender. Research shows if someone's taller, they tend to make more money. If someone's more attractive, they tend to be more successful at work. We react to young people different than we react to old people. We just have certain associations with different people. So this is something that can impact all of us. Sometimes the way we kind of look or act is better for a situation, sometimes it's worse. And virtual communication has this benefit that it can often either mask or add in extra information. So when it comes to bias, there's really one question. Whose bias are you trying to reduce? Research shows that if you're trying to reduce other people's bias, so you're concerned they might have certain biases about how an individual looks or sounds or whatever else, it's actually better if they know that these differences exist to use richer modes of communication. The reason for this is that if all I know about somebody is that they're a man and they're really young, or they're a woman and they're old, or whatever else, and we're communicating via email, because you don't have any other information, that information gets used more heavily than it should. Whereas when you get to talk to the person, whether that's via phone or via video, you get to learn more about that person. So those other biases you might have tend to be less impactful because you're focused more on who they actually are because you get that extra information. On the other side of this, if you want to reduce people's own concerns about their category, so for instance, they're in a situation where they don't feel comfortable speaking up in a meeting. Maybe because they're different than everyone else, or maybe they're just more junior than everyone else in that meeting. Less rich modes of communication are better because we feel safer behind the screen. As an example, research shows for negotiations that often women will be less aggressive because it's more appropriate for men to be more competitive. But when it comes to virtual negotiations and email ones, the genders behave equally here because we're not as worried about what other people think or expect of us potentially in a situation. So that can be more equalizing there. So it depends on if you're trying to decrease other people's biases, richer is better. If you're worried that people might stay quiet or might not engage as much, then less rich is better because we all feel freer to act however we want and not bound by others' expectations of us over less rich modes of communication.
One of the other things you talk about in your books is how artificial intelligence has started to creep into our communications more and more. So, what are the downsides to using artificial intelligence in our communications, and how can Ping ensure that we don't lose the human element we need to make our interactions authentic?
Artificial intelligence, these AI chatbot tools, the large language models, they're great for increasing efficiency. So many of us have this temptation of, why don't I have ChatGPT or Perplexity or Gemini write my message? And I generally advise against that for important interactions. And research suggests that to be true. And here's why. In most interactions, the other person's probably not going to realize you used AI to write that email. but every once in a while they will. For instance, maybe it uses words you don't normally use or punctuation you don't normally use, and the other person knows how you usually communicate. Or maybe you spoke with the person in person. So, on a Monday morning, you had a conversation with one of your colleagues, and they mentioned how it was a rough weekend because their whole family got the stomach bug of some kind. And then in the afternoon, you send an AI written email that says, "I hope you had a great weekend!" exclamation mark. And it misses what you two talked about. And AI will never know everything that's in our heads. And because it's missing that information, at some point it may miss something that it shouldn't because you didn't relay that piece of information at the time. And yes, this may be very rare. But if someone realizes 1 out of 100 times that you used AI to communicate with them, whether it's an email or a script for a video call or anything else, they're going to start questioning every single virtual interaction they've had with you. They're going to think, well, wait, are the rest of them, have they been AI as well? And if they're questioning whether they're just interacting with AI, they're going to next ask, well, why am I even interacting with this person in the first place? And you don't want your boss or important customer to be asking, well, why do I even need this person anymore? And that is so consequential, it's just not worth the risk. You want to make sure your words are your own in these important interactions. That said, for brainstorming, great, use AI. For editing, great, use AI. For low stakes, repeated interactions that are not complex, yeah, the downsides are much less down. But for those interactions that do matter, you want to make sure those words are your own.
So, what is the most important thing that you'd like leaders to know about virtual communications?
For leaders, it's important to think about a few things. One is that they get so busy, they never have time to stop and think, am I doing this the right way? And because of that, we end up in these communication cycles that are horribly unproductive. We have a meeting scheduled every week because we've always had a meeting for this. Or even email chain that's gone on for 100 more emails than it should have because no one said, hey, why don't we pick up the phone and just solve this in 5 minutes? Once we get in a mindset of we meet for this, we email for that, it's hard to break that cycle, even if it is horribly unproductive. So the first thing that's most important is taking a moment and trying to be mindful about, how am I using this? Is this the right approach? And questioning your assumptions there, even though it takes a little bit of time and effort, can save you a lot of time in the long term. The second most important thing is learning and experimenting. There are answers out there of what's the best way to communicate and when. How do we leverage these things better? We don't just have to accept that something's worse than something else. There are ways to improve it. So taking that effort to learn and then experiment, because everything's not going to work identically across every situation. So being willing to try out new things with your team. Think about, hey, we're going to try something new. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll try something else. But I want to think about ways we can continue to improve our communication. For companies and organizations and executives who engage in that kind of communication experimentation, they tend to have some of the best cultures, some of the highest productivity. Their employees have the best well-being because they find the best ways to communicate and they take input from those beneath them to understand, okay, is this working or is this not? So those 3 steps, stopping, being mindful, learning, and experimenting, are what make the best communicators.
Where can we learn more about you and your work?
The organization which I consult from, Ping Group, has a website, pinggroup.org, that you can visit, where I also have a whole bunch of free resources, including a communication styles tool, a team communication norming tool, that are all freely downloadable at pinggroup.org.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time and your resources.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, Christine, and thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit the podcast link at fjc.dcn/EE. You can also listen and subscribe to the podcast via Apple, Spotify, and on YouTube. Episodes are also available on fjc.gov. In Session, Leading the Judiciary is produced by Shelley Easter. Our program is supported by Lori Murphy, Malcolm Everett, Jamie Mitchell, and the entire studio and live production team. This podcast was produced at U.S. taxpayer expense. Until next time, thanks for listening.